All right, welcome back, friends. So in the last video, we saw different event types. Mouse over, mouse out. We made a hover effect. We created a small to-do list. So all in all, throughout this course, we've learned what JavaScript is. And JavaScript, to review one more time, is a lightweight, cross-platform, object-oriented computer programming language. Yeah, and then we talked about the role of JavaScript in web development and how very useful it is. We talked about how JavaScript works with HTML and CSS. Because you got to remember that in web development, HTML is responsible for content while CSS is responsible for styling. But it's JavaScript that's responsible for user actions and interactability. Then we employed some variables. We talked about naming them. We said that a variable name cannot start with symbols. That's very important, except for the $sign and the underscore sign. Oh, and also, you don't want to name, in fact, you cannot name a variable with a JavaScript keyword like this or function. But then we dug into logical operators. So with them, we learned some conditional statements. We talked about if-else statements. Then we saw JavaScript comparison operators like less than, bigger than, and equal to. Then we got into loops. We learned the purpose of a loop. We talked about dry code as a concept, and we saw the syntax of a while loop as well as a for loop. Then we began to use functions. We talked about function expressions and function declarations and the differences between them. Then we saw the difference between console.log and the return statement. And then, do you remember how to pass an argument to a function? Then we learned a lot about arrays. We saw how we can define an array, how we can add data to an array. And then we talked about built-in array methods like push and pop, shift and unshift. Then we went through a small to-do list. But you got to remember our array methods, push and pop, and shift and unshift, index of, slice. Those methods we talked about a lot. Then I introduced you to an array iteration, where we were able to use a for loop for an array iteration. Then we got into a built-in array method, which is the for each. And remember that I told you that we use that for an array iteration as well. That, my friends, is a very useful method. And to clarify that, we compared these methods, the for loop and the for each. We also talked about, well, one of the most important topics in JavaScript, which is objects. We saw what an object is and why we like to use it and how to use it, how we can define an object, how we can retrieve data from an object, and how we can update an object, as well as how we can store a complex data set inside of an object. Then we talked about some challenging topics. I must admit, the this keyword, but I think you got it. Just remember that if we use the this keyword in a regular function, it points to the global object, which is window. And if we use this as a keyword in a method, then it refers to the object that contains this method. Very simple rule, but it's a very important one. So then we got into DOM. We talked about what the DOM is, why DOM manipulation is important, and then we saw a couple of example websites. Talked about DOM manipulation, and we said that this is a two-step process: select and manipulate. DOM basically is an interface between JavaScript and HTML and CSS. So let's briefly review what DOM is again. So when we load an HTML page to the browser takes our HTML and it takes every single HTML element and turns them into JavaScript objects. So it's these objects that are stored inside of a top-level object, which is called document. And then when we want to reach HTML elements, we use this document object. And therefore, DOM stands for Document Object Model. All right, so then we talked about DOM manipulation. We saw different select methods to be able to manipulate DOM. And these are get element by ID, get elements by class name, get elements by tag name, query selector, and query selector all. Then we employed some manipulation methods. We saw how we can change the style of an HTML element with JavaScript, how we can add and remove classes, how we can change content of an element, and then how we can change the attributes of elements. And then we dug into event handlers. We talked about how we can use them in games or while making a scroll effect or in menus or in forms. We can use them basically wherever there is user interaction. Now, some of the event types include click, hover, drag and drop, pressing the enter key, and in the very last video, we used mouse over and mouse out events as well. And again, there are hundreds of these event types, so we saw where we can find these events and how we can get some help from these websites when we use our best buddy Google. So you don't have to memorize much, if anything. You just need to be able to make some Google time. But then we talked about that when we want to attach an event listener to an element, first we'll need to select the element that we want to attach an event listener to, and then we can add that event listener. Okay, my friends, so you have now learned and hopefully will master the fundamentals of JavaScript. So maybe next time we meet, you'll be teaching the course. No, I'm just kidding. Have fun practicing because there's a lot of code to write out there. Remember, stay dry, and we'll all be okay. See you next time.